Our problem is take the bank or split right now. Do not go home, do not pack, nothing. 30 seconds flat from now, we are gone on our separate ways. That's it.
I grew up very much inner city in Chicago, kind of late 50s, very early 60s. Been an immigrant family in a neighborhood that had immigrants from southern Italy and from Eastern Europe, and making their way, you know, kind of coming from what Al Pacino called the lower mids, you know, the lower middle class, you know, that upper working class, lower middle class, kind of breaking into the American system, you know, as they could. So it's less about a fascination than it is about an environment. You knew that this cigar store, you know, had a card room in the back. There's names in the newspapers. It's very, very much a Chicago thing in the sense that front page came out of Chicago, came out of that sensibility. Mike Royko's column, you know, writing about this famous family of thieves who were kind of tragicomic, the Pansco family, 3 brothers and a sister, you know. I mean, so it became it's kind of the lore of the city, as it were. So in terms of knowing about it, it was in the air. It was just part of life on the streets.
Michael and I had a mutual friend in Chicago whose name was Nate Grossman. He said that he had a friend of his who wanted to do law enforcement, police genre stuff. And here I'm a cop wanting to be a writer, and Nate thought, wow, I got to put these 2 guys together.
Chuck and I became very close friends, and Chuck was a detective in Chicago in a kind of a major crime unit. Every city has one major crime unit. In LA, it's the Robbery Homicide Division. In Chicago, it was a CIU. And then through Chuck particularly, started hearing his encounter with the real Neil McCauley.
Neil McCauley was 49 years old the day we met, and he had already served 25 years in the penitentiary. Of that 25, 8 of it was on Alcatraz, and 4 years on Alcatraz in isolation, what they called the hole. The conversation took place almost 40 years ago now. Knowing his background as I did, I'm not going to rehabilitate this man, okay? And I know that going in. So I said to Neil, why don't you go somewhere else and cause trouble? And he said, I like Chicago. You know? It was just real simple stuff. So I said to Neil, you realize that one day you're going to be taking down a score and I'm going to be there. Then he said, well, look at the other side of the coin. I might have to eliminate you. And I remember the very last thing I said to him was, I'm sure we'll meet again. You know, I just said to myself, I wonder where this is going to lead us.
Chuck had cut into the crew, knew the crew was going to do a burglary of a department store. And when Neil McCauley went in, there was one thing that was out of place. He had scoped out the score ahead of time, and he knew everything that was supposed to be there in terms of vehicles and parking lots and everything else. And Neil McCauley didn't know what was wrong, but he knew something was wrong.
I had 2 detectives on the inside of the store. And once you get into a place like that, you can't move around. It's discipline like you've never known, believe me. And it was later that night, it was maybe 5 or 6 hours later, and we had men all around on the outside. And we get a call on the walkie-talkie that the crew's here. So this is going to go down, you know. And of course, you're inside, and you know now that here comes this moment that you've dreaded for so long in so far that you realize that maybe if things don't go absolutely right, you can get hurt or, God forbid, killed. They moved in to the downstairs area, which there was a little basement area in the back of this store, and they just sat there for maybe 5 or 10 minutes listening to see if there's any movement. To this day, I'll never understand what it was that possessed the detective to get up and walk to the washroom, because he couldn't stand sitting in this one position anymore. And the man had to go. And I had told these 2 guys, you gotta go, you go in your pants or you bring a cup, but you don't get up and you don't move. And when this guy got up and walked across the floor, that's all Neil had to hear. Goodbye. They boogied, and that was it. That was the end of it. So now the really damaging thing is, now he knew someone was on him. And prior to that, they didn't know anyone was on them.
Well, that kind of self-discipline, that kind of real professionalism, Chuck admired. And he would say, look how great this guy, look how cool this guy is to figure this out, look how smart he is to have seen that and pull back and never go back, even though Neil McCauley had invested $30,000, $40,000 in setting up the score. He was walked away from the score and was never going to go back, was never going to take it, because it was a risk versus reward equation. And because one thing was out of place, the risk component just skyrocketed.
I think sometimes in the course of events, police officers can see a particular individual that they've been chasing, they've been working on, perhaps as a wily, clever opponent that in some ways mirrors their own self-image.
If Chuck was a thief, what struck me was Chuck's sociopathic perspective about it. It's not sociopathic in Chuck's, but if Chuck had been a thief, it would have been sociopathic. What struck me about it was the duality. And that's not what one encounters in fiction. That Chuck had tremendous regard for this guy, had a lot of respect for him, was fascinated by him intellectually, thought the guy was terrific.
If I didn't know who he was and know as much about him as I did, then, I would have probably thought that, he's probably a halfway decent guy.
In fiction, you would think, well, that means that there's a rapport, that maybe he'll cut him some slack. And that wasn't the case at all. Not even one iota of it. Not even a hesitation. Chuck would hesitate not 1 second, dropping a hammer and killing Neil McCauley, which he did subsequently in 1964.
There's a supermarket at 47th and Cicero. It was a day that they did their check cashing. So the armored car dropped off a lot of cash. We had tailed Neil McCauley's crew endlessly. And then the next thing you knew, they drove into the parking lot, and 3 of them came out of the car and went in. In the windows of this supermarket, they had all these advertisements. We could still see all the people that put their hands in the air and what have you, so we knew that it was going down at that time. And then we didn't try to go in. There were too many people inside. It would have been awful. As they came out the door, they spotted my partner and I coming across the street with guns in our hands, and they opened fire at us. But then it was a foot chase, and we got them individually in between gangways of homes, was where we finished them.
And thus the end of Neil McCauley, a largely forgotten figure until Michael Mann resurrected him in this movie.
I didn't mean to be rude. I didn't recognize you. I work in metals. I'm a salesman. My name's Neil.
It was fortuitous that I met Chuck Adamson, who then introduced me to John Santucci and a number of other, and a whole network of people. And I always took these people in one way or another. If they could act, I had them act in these things. So Bill Brown, who was one of the thieves who stole the Marlboro Diamond out of London, has a big speaking part in Thief, and Chuck had a speaking part. And one of Chuck's partners, Dennis Farina, who at the time was still a detective in the Chicago Police Department, had a role in it.
Charlie Adamson called me from Las Vegas and told us that Michael Mann was going to come to Chicago and that he wanted to meet with us, and he wanted some technical advice in preparation for the movie. So myself and some other guys, we took him around and introduced him to some people. Charlie more so than anybody else.
I started him out from the police side of things. And then he would ask me questions in terms of the relationship between professional thieves and cops. And he came out with this very clear, distinct picture of who's who.
He knew these people. He knew the criminals and he knew the cops. He knew them. And he loved them both. And you could feel it in him. There's real respect, oddly enough, for both sides of the law in Michael.
And I think he was more interested in the personal life and how the job was the wedge, that eventually deteriorated the relationship and it broke up. So he was very interested in that.
Being a police officer is going to change somebody. It's going to change their personality, the way they interact with people after they've been a police officer for some time because of what they see. They just see nothing but, for the most part, the bad side of human nature.
I described the job as many times your eyes were forced to see more than your soul could take.
How else do you do this type of work unless you find it that it rejuvenates you in some way, because it's too dark a profession.
It's a very sexy, alluring thing, you know, and you can get caught up in it because it becomes a challenge. You know, you say to yourself, I'm not going to let this person get away with that if I have anything to do with it. And that's what starts eating away at relationships, where you start thinking, well, I'd rather go follow this guy to find out what happens than to meet my wife at 8 o'clock for dinner. So you sacrifice one for the other. And oftentimes you justify it by saying this is a bad guy, and if I get him off the street, I can help somebody. But a lot of people don't understand that.
Then you have the policeman who deals with this stuff day in and day out and gets so far into the criminal mentality, and that becomes their milieu, that sometimes they become almost indistinguishable.
You know, there's always a thing about, they always say about cops sometimes that on the other side takes one to know one. There's a certain element of, you know, a cop that understands the criminal mentality in order to be able to even deal with them, you know, so it's like another side of the coin.
You've heard the expression, the line is very thin, you know. And it probably is, in the sense that you have to think like a thief to catch a thief.
It's an adrenaline rush. Police officers often talk about it. You suddenly feel like Superman. You feel invincible. You feel that nothing is going to stop you from moving ahead with what you're doing. The adrenaline rush works on both sides of the great divide between law and order and criminality.
Crime is it's as possible as anything you could imagine, and meeting some of the guys that really do this, it was pretty exciting.
It used to be years ago when I was coming up, people who wanted to be thieves, they learned how to be a thief. They learned how to do things slick. They learned how to deal from the bottom of the deck. They learned how to go through the roof of a building with a drill and bit and a circular saw. They learned how to punch, peel, and burn open safes.
There was a creative aspect to these guys, and they're very interesting guys. Bright, very charming. There's a certain moral code that they carry that's quite interesting and respectable in many ways. But of course, they're criminals.
Everything's about making that big score. So you don't have to work for the man, you don't have to go back to prison. You're gonna make this one big score, get this nice big chunk of money, and retire to an island somewhere.
It's the doing of it is the juice. It's like playing, I played football. It's like, knocking some guy's brains out when he's coming across the middle is the juice, Winning is fun too, but you want to knock that guy's ass, and you want him to know that, you come over here again, I'm going to try and kill you. We're playing football, baby. This isn't, it's real.
It's someplace that has a value. The criminal, it provides everything. It provides wealth, it provides comradeship, it provides status. It fills in all the things on the other side that you should get through society on a very petty level, usually. Actually, the kind of gang that he had in Heat, sometimes there's no mob like that operating in the United States, and at the most there's one or two. It's here many of those scores, those big scores like that. Because if you've got enough money to take off that kind of a score, to set it up, you don't need to steal, you know what I mean?
Everybody who's a professional criminal knows they're going to jail or going back to jail. You're going to the joint. So you have peace of mind then. You know where you're at. And if you die, good. I'm tired of this way of living, this angst. Or I had a good run. These guys know they're alive, and they're crazy.
I can only imagine when you get out, you say, you know what, I'm never going back in. All right, I'm going to straighten out my life, and I'm just going to move forward. The realization is, when you get out, nobody wants you to go straight. Nobody wants to give you a break. You're an ex-con.
What is this? Where do you think you're going?
So these stories that I heard and became kind of apocryphal and rich, I have always found when you find those rare events, I find them more dynamic and more exciting than what one can make up. Those are very fascinating people.